The Sumerians wrote about this 4,000 years ago in a text called the Atrahasis Epic, which is one of the oldest stories ever found. It predates the Bible by over 1,000 years. The gods called the Anunnaki create humans specifically to serve as a workforce. They describe the process in detail. A god named Enki and a goddess named Ninhursag take the genetic material of an existing hominid and combine it with the divine essence to produce a new being. A hybrid. Something that didn't exist before, and the first versions they created couldn't even reproduce, but the later versions could, and those are the versions that spread all across the earth. For a long time, scholars called that mythology, a story that ancient people told just to explain their existence. Then scientists started mapping what makes human DNA different from every other primate on the planet, and they found something that doesn't have a clean explanation. We have 3,171 regions in our genome called human accelerated regions, HAR for short. These are sequences of DNA that have been almost completely unchanged across vertebrate evolutions for hundreds of millions of years, conserved through fish, through reptiles, through our primate ancestors. Apparently they're essential to life in a way that they were locked in place. And then in humans, suddenly and only in humans, they changed. Fast. Faster than random mutation explains. The biggest cluster of these changes affects the genes responsible for brain development, cognitive function, language, and the expansion of the cortex. In the entire primate lineage, those sequences didn't move, but in humans, they completely rewrote themselves. The Sumerian texts are saying that someone did this to us, and now science is saying that it actually looks like someone may have. Before we get into the genetics, I want to talk about what the Sumerian texts say on their own terms, separate from what all the interpretations they have layered on top of them. The Atrahasis is a real ancient Akkadian text. It dates approximately to 1700 BC and references earlier Sumerian sources. It describes the Anunnaki as arriving to Earth and setting lesser gods called the Ajiji to work mining and building, and eventually created humans when the Ajiji rebelled against the hard labor. The creation process in the text is very specific. Enki and the mother goddess Ninhursag take clay, which some researchers interpret as genetic material of an existing hominid, and combine it with the blood or essence of a divine being. The early creations were flawed. Some had wrong proportions, some couldn't see, some couldn't reproduce. The text reads like a trial and error process, and eventually a stable version emerged that could procreate. A separate text, Enki and Ninmah, describe the same creation event in even more detail. It lists specific biological defects in early attempts that read like what geneticists call failed hybridization outcomes. Beings with no functional organs, beings that couldn't survive independently, and then finally a stable version that worked. Mainstream scholars read that as mythology. Creation stories are universal. Every culture has them, and the Sumerians had theirs. But what separates the Sumerian account from other ancient creation stories? Most ancient creation myths describe gods forming humans from nothing, or from breath, or from divine will. The Sumerian text describes a biological process, trial runs, failed versions, corrections, a described mechanism that doesn't read like mythology but more like a documented procedure. In 2026, a researcher named Catherine Pollard at the University of California, Santa Cruz published a paper in Nature identifying the first human accelerated region, a sequence of DNA she called HAR1. HAR1 is 118 base pairs long. In the genomes of chickens, mice, rats, and our closest primate relatives, it's been relatively unchanged for over 300 million years. Conserved sequences are ones that evolution has preserved across the entire span because changing them is apparently dangerous. They do something essential for life that breaking them would cost the organism its survival. HAR1 in humans has 18 changes. In a sequence that didn't move across 300 million years of evolution, it accumulated 18 human-specific mutations. And HAR1 is active specifically during fetal brain development. It switches on in the developing cortex between 7 and 19 weeks of gestation and controls the organization of neurons and the most sophisticated part of the human brain. Since Pollard's 2006 paper, researchers have identified 3,171 accelerated regions across the human genome. The single largest cluster of HARs is found around the MPA-S3 gene, a transcription factor involved in brain development. A 2025 paper published in Science Advances identified an ancient enhancer sequence that has been rapidly evolving specifically in the human lineage and promotes what researchers describe as neural development and cognitive flexibility. Conserved for hundreds of millions of years in every other vertebrate but rewritten only in humans. Researchers studying HARs describe the pattern as acceleration. The normal rate of genetic change in these conserved sequences across all vertebrates is essentially zero. In humans, it's spiked disproportionately in sequences related to how we think. The standard evolutionary explanation is that selection pressure, some advantage conferred by these changes, drove the acceleration. Evolution found a path through the conserved sequences and rewrote them because the rewritten versions just worked better. That explanation is coherent, but the standard model of evolution has difficulty accounting for how fast the changes happened. Random mutation and selection works gradually. The hard changes described in the literature are described as accelerated. The term that keeps coming up across all of these papers and research is rapid acceleration, not gradual acceleration. And there's a separate genetic anomaly that doesn't get talked about a lot in this context. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Every other great ape, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, bonobos have 48, 2 more than us. The standard explanation, and it's a solid one supported by evidence, is that 2 ancestral primate chromosomes fused end-to-end at some point in our evolutionary history to create human chromosome 2. The evidence for that fusion is there. There's a vestigial telomere sequence in the middle of chromosome 2, exactly where you'd expect to find 2 fused ends of 2 separate chromosomes, so the fusion did happen. What's still unsettled is the mechanism and the timing. Chromosomal fusion events of this kind are extremely rare in mammals. They happen, but they're uncommon, and they often result in reduced fertility and hybrid offspring. For a fusion event to spread through an entire population rather than dying out in the first few generations requires either a very small founding population or a very strong selection pressure. The timing places the fusion events somewhere in the period when anatomically modern humans were emerging, roughly 700,000 to 300,000 years ago, depending on which analysis you look at. The same general period when the human-accelerated regions were accumulating their human-specific changes. Now, a chromosomal reduction event and an accelerated rewriting of conserved brain development sequences happening in the same evolutionary window isn't proof of anything. But if you found that in a lab organism somewhere, you would stop and ask if something intervened in that population's genome. And this is where the genetics connect to the Sumerian account most directly. Anatomically modern humans with skeletons indistinguishable from ours, appeared in the fossil record approximately 300,000 years ago. For roughly 200,000 years after that, the archaeological record shows almost nothing. Stone tools, fire, basic shelter, the same things hominids had been doing for 1,000,000 years before us. Then approximately 70,000 to 50,000 years ago, something happened. Symbolic art appeared, musical instruments, complex language evidenced by the nature of artifacts, long-distance trade networks, ritualized burial, abstract thinking expressed in hundreds of forms simultaneously across multiple regions that had been separated for tens of thousands of years. Researchers call this the giant leap forward, the cognitive revolution, the behavioral modernity transition. The names differ, but the observation is all the same. Anatomically modern humans existed for 200,000 years without expressing the cognitive capabilities that define what we mean by civilization. And then within a geologically short window, we express all of those cognitive capabilities at once. The human-accelerated regions, the brain development sequences that rewrote themselves only in humans, are proposed by researchers studying them as the genetic basis for this leap. The HARS promoted the expansion of the cortex and the organization of the neural networks responsible for language, abstract thought, and social complexity. What the genetics doesn't fully explain is the timing gap. If the hard changes occurred somewhere in the 700,000 to 300,000 year window, and the cognitive explosion they apparently enabled only expressed itself 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, something triggered that expression of capabilities that were genetically present but behaviorally dormant for at least 200,000 years. The Atrahasis epic described the Anunnaki needing a workforce that could follow complex instructions, use tools, and organize labor. They didn't want a creature of instinct, they wanted a creature that can think, communicate, and coordinate, and the text describes the creation of exactly that capability in beings that previously lacked it. Whether that's a coincidence of description or something more than that, well, that's what we're here trying to figure out. Now, as always, let's talk about what the evidence supports and what it doesn't. Human-accelerated regions have several peer-reviewed studies published about them in Nature, Cell, and Science Advances. The acceleration of change in conserved brain development sequences, specifically in human lineage, is extensively studied. Mutations in HARS have been linked to cognitive disruption. When they malfunction, they contribute to schizophrenia, autism spectrum disorder, and other conditions affecting higher cognitive function. They are the most studied explanation for what makes human cognition different from every other primate. In the chromosome 2 fusion, the evidence for that is very solid, and the cognitive leap is legitimate and documented in archaeological record. The Sumerian text, the Atrahasis epic, and the Enki and Ninmah creation text exists, and they describe what they describe. What's not proven is any direct connection between what the Sumerian texts describe and what the genetics show. The Anunnaki as literal beings who intervened in human genetics is Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, not what the texts themselves explicitly state, and mainstream scholars dispute his translations extensively. What's interesting to me in this parallel is that an ancient civilization produced detailed written accounts of a genetic intervention in the human lineage by more advanced beings. They described a trial and error process that produced a being with enhanced cognitive capabilities. Modern genetics has found specific rapid changes in conserved brain development sequences that contributed to exactly that enhanced cognitive capability described. The timing of both, the ancient text placing creation events roughly in the period when modern human genetics was undergoing its most dramatic changes, is either very meaningful or very coincidental. That's my honest position. The evidence doesn't prove the Sumerian account, it just makes the question harder to dismiss than it used to be. If the genetic intervention described in the Sumerian text is taken seriously as a hypothesis, not as a proven fact, but as a serious possibility, then the beings who performed it didn't create us and disappear. They created us for a purpose. The text describes that purpose as labor, the management of resources, the performance of tasks that creators no longer wanted to do themselves. And then the text describes something interesting happening. Enki, the being that's described as humanity's creator and advocate, appears repeatedly in the Sumerian accounts as someone who wants humans to have more capability than the other Anunnaki are comfortable with them having. He gives them knowledge they weren't supposed to have. He warns them of coming catastrophes against the will of other Anunnaki leadership. The story of Enki and humanity reads like a story of a scientist who created something and then protected it from those who wanted to keep it limited. Whether that's mythology, history, or something in between, the civilization that produced the oldest written records we have was describing a relationship with beings who created us. Modern genetics is finding evidence that something unusual happened to human DNA in a specific window of time that accelerated cognitive development in ways that standard gradual evolution struggles to fully account for. And those two things can exist in the same conversation now. So do you think we were genetically altered? I mean, the Great Leap is kind of hard to explain. If you follow traditional evolution, it's off the path of that, and the only way to do this is to accelerate it somehow. But that could also be natural, so who knows? But the fact that there's ancient stories connecting that to this and the modern science is like, wait a second, there might be something to this. Kind of interesting. Well, who really knows? All I could do is sit down here, connect dots, and try to make sense of all this crazy stuff. As always, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe, like, and drop that comment on this video. I'd love to hear what you think about this one. Until next time, I'll talk to you later.